In this video, we'll talk about transcription, or how to transcribe qualitative interviews. And this is of course relevant if you have audio recorded your interviews and you want to be able to analyze written text and not just the audio files, which is a common situation in research projects using qualitative interviews. And remember that transcribing is about transforming oral interviews, oral answers given in an interview into written text. And when transcribing, it's important to be aware of some key differences between spoken and written language. First of all, when we speak or when you do an interview, you will usually have access to the interviewee's body language. Usually interviews are conducted face-to-face. They can of course also be conducted using telephone or Skype, but in most cases, you will be able to see the body language of the person you're interviewing. Body language is not visible when you're reading a written transcript of an interview. In spoken language, what we say can be interrupted by laughter, by other kinds of sounds, and there's also intonation that can be used to add emphasis to a sentence. This is really important. And they will give some clues about how the interviewee intended what he or she said to be understood. Spoken language is also different from written language in the sense that when we speak, we don't have the opportunity to go back and edit what we said. That's often a problem when making these kind of videos, that I speak and then I say something, I might start on a sentence and never complete it. So incomplete sentences are more common in spoken language than in written language, because in written language we would go back and make sure to complete all our sentences so that our text will flow better for the reader. In spoken language we also include a lot of small words that we might not use when writing, and also a lot of and and a lot of these sounds that sometimes are just there because we're struggling to find the right words. Sometimes they can be useful and important clues for you as a researcher, because they might indicate that the interviewee is struggling to answer, that this is something they maybe haven't thought about before, that they are kind of expressing their thoughts there and then and maybe haven't thought about these issues before. Spoken language might include dialect. Most of us, if we speak in a dialect, at least we write in a more standardized form. And then of course when you are transcribing, you have to think about, should I transcribe in dialect or in a more written form? And there's also some important differences when it comes to choice of words, and this really differs from language to language. For instance, in Norwegian, there are fewer differences between spoken and written Norwegian than in, for instance, English, where you might have two terms that mean more or less the same. One is used in spoken language, one is used in written language. And then in terms of grammar, sentences are different. We might even, if we speak in our mother tongue, start a sentence and finish it slightly different than what we intended, and because of that, grammatical mistakes might be included. Or it might be that you're interviewing someone who's using a language that's not their mother tongue and that they don't speak in a grammatically proper way. Or it could also be part of a sociolect or a specific way of speaking this language for a specific group of people, that the grammar rules are slightly different from the more standardized form of the language. And all these differences, and I'm sure other differences could be included as well between spoken and written language, means that you, when you transcribe an interview, have to make some choices about how to do the transcription. First of all, and this is not really related to the differences between oral and written language, you have to decide, should I transcribe the whole interview or only parts of the interview? Because transcription is quite time consuming, it's tempting to only transcribe those parts of the interview that are relevant. But then, of course, the question is, how do I know at the beginning which parts of the interview will be relevant? You might try to transcribe only parts of the interview, maybe leaving out, if you did a bit of small talk in the beginning and the end that was not really relevant, maybe you had to do a small break in the middle because something happened. Of course, you can leave out those parts. I would encourage you to not leave out substantial parts too early, because it might be as your understanding of your topic and as the analysis progresses that some of these parts that you thought were relevant in the beginning turns out to maybe be more relevant later on. But then a choice at least you have to make is, what do you do with pauses, laughter, sighing, the ums and the ums that some of us at least, tend to include when we speak? Should you include them when you're transcribing, or should you leave them out? Again, there are good reasons for doing both. You could decide to exclude them because, especially if you're quoting from interviews in your final thesis, or when you're doing the analysis and reading through the transcriptions, having to read a lot of ums and ums can be quite frustrating. At the same time, laughter, pauses, and these ums and ums might also communicate something about the research topic that can be relevant for you to include, at least when you're analyzing the material, and maybe also when you're presenting or the material and your findings in terms of quotes, so that the reader can also understand that this was not something that the interview just kind of said in a long paragraph as if this was something they had thought through and knew very well, but an understanding that they expressed in the interview as they were thinking through these things, making some small pauses and then continuing their story. If people speak dialect, should you transcribe in the dialect or using more standard language? There are good reasons for both choices. Transcribing in dialect will be more true to the way that the informant spoke, and sometimes there can be words that are used in dialect that do not exist in the standard language that you would then have to translate somehow. At the same time, dialects can be hard to write because they don't have a standard pronunciation. And this is also related to research ethics, because if you transcribe in a dialect, would you then risk that the identity of the informant is more easily revealed? Or is that not an issue because everyone is speaking this dialect? In terms of grammar and grammatical mistakes that people make when they speak, whether they speak their mother tongue or another language, should you correct these mistakes or should you leave them there in the text? Again, could be good reasons for both choices. Correcting the mistakes will make it easier for the reader to read quotes from an interview because they don't have to stumble across the grammatical mistakes and being confused. At the same time, the grammatical mistakes were there in the original, and they might be important in order to reveal something about your topic or the informants. Oral or written style, when we speak, we tend to make pauses, we have incomplete sentences, as I mentioned. How do you deal with those issues when you transcribe? Do you try to change things into a more written style, or do you keep the more oral style? Of course, keeping the oral style is more true to how things were expressed in the interview. At the same time, when your reader reads, especially quotes from interviews in the final master thesis or final research report, they are reading these quotes. They are not listening to them. And when we read oral language, it can feel and we can get a different impression of what was being said and about the person who said these things when we read it than when we hear it. So you might risk that the reader gets a totally different image of the interviewee by reading quotes than you had by listening to the interviewee speaking. So sometimes there can be good reasons for changing things because you want to make sure that the interviewee is not presented in a bad way, including a lot of incomplete sentences, grammatical mistakes, etc., that might make the interviewee appear less intelligent, less coherent, etc. Then, of course, when we speak, we don't speak in dots and commas. Punctuation. When do you include dots and commas? Sometimes that can be important in terms of giving meaning to the sentences. Where you add a dot might change the meaning of a sentence completely. And then you have to be conscious about where you include these dots and commas. And lastly, what do you do with incomprehensible words? Sometimes when we transcribe, we are not able to hear what was being said. This is especially the case when several people are talking at the same time or close to each other in a group interview or focus group, but it could also be the case in individual interviews because of bad quality of the recording equipment, because of background noises, etc. Or because people speak a language they're not so familiar with and maybe their pronunciation is a bit strange sometimes and you're not able to understand what they're saying. Then you should probably just include in brackets that, okay, here the interviewer said something, but I'm not exactly sure what they said. And all these choices that you make in your method section or method chapter, you should say something about these choices. You should say, how did you choose? What kind of choice did you make and why? Justify your choices. And as I said, there can be good reasons for different kinds of choices. So it's not about finding what is right or wrong, but finding what is best in your context, given your research focus and your research questions. Good luck transcribing interviews.